When Israel fights Iran, we are also fighting America's own war. October 7 is already inspiring Iranian-controlled Islamic terrorists to repeat the same act of terrorism on U.S. soil. In fact, in the 2025 threat assessment published by the FBI, stipulates the Ayatollah regime of Iran, together with China and Russia, are already acting on U.S. soil, planning terrorist acts against the U.S. When Israel fights Iran, we are also fighting America's own war.
Welcome to Proclaiming Justice, a podcast from PJTN that focuses the light of truth on vital issues in today's headlines that impact every American. I'm your host, Laurie Cardoza-Moore, founder and president of Proclaiming Justice to the Nations, and I'm here to educate, motivate, and activate you to action. I want to arm you with the truth and the facts you'll need to fight and preserve our constitutional republic and uphold the Judeo-Christian values our nation was founded upon.
Well, first and foremost, I learned from friends of mine in Texas to approach such challenge with a state of mind that it ain't the first time, ain't the last time, and ain't the worst time. And certainly, as Jews, as a Jewish state, we have had many, many challenges, which are basically uphill challenges, but they have always been an engine causing resurgence to higher and higher level. When it comes to the isolationist attitude towards Israel, first and foremost, there's no realization, no comprehension of the reality of U.S. Israel relations. The isolationists view Israel as a burden. They view the relations as a one-way street with the U.S. giving and Israel receiving. They do not realize the huge scope of benefits to the U.S., which in fact exceeds by far the scope, the dollar scope of annual foreign aid to Israel, which is not really foreign aid, it's an annual investment in Israel, which yields back to the American taxpayer return of investment in the magnitude of hundreds of percents year in and year out. And I can give many examples. Maybe a recent example of the U.S. bombing of the 3 nuclear reactor centers in Iran. This bombing followed an Israeli offensive of some 10 days on Iran, which completely demolished the Iranian Air Force and the Iranian ground-to-air defense systems, which enabled the U.S. to carry out its offensive on Iran unimpeded by the Iranian Air Force or defense systems. No ally of the U.S. has the capability to carry out such a service to the U.S. Many of the allies don't even have the will to carry that out. But more importantly, Israel carried out its own Air Force offensive on Iran with some 200 American-made combat aircraft, the F-35, F-16, and F-15. Obviously, Israel is extremely grateful for the U.S. for receiving that critical hardware. However, performing that offensive, which in fact was the most complex, the most effective Air Force offensive carried out by anyone since the Second World War. By carrying it out, we performed as the luxury showroom of the American aerospace industry. Namely, the Chinese, the Russian, the British, the French, they all manufacture combat aircraft, but they don't have a showroom which every single day show the very substantial edge that the American combat planes have over others. Carrying out that operation against Iran reinforced the decision by many countries to buy American products. It's like a AAA store. A AAA store comes to a new shopping mall, and other stores want to come there, and shoppers are flooding that shopping mall. Likewise with Israel, when we use American military systems, without which we could not make ends meet, there's no doubt about that, but carrying it out constitutes our returning to the Americans the benefits of the American military systems. It's not only encouraging more exports of the American aerospace industry, it's the daily lessons which we share with the American manufacturers. Every single day, the Israeli Air Force benefits from flying the plane in a do-or-die state of mind, in operational mode, which Americans rarely experience. And that mode of flying the plane yields certain lessons, overcoming some glitches, overcoming some mechanical or technical problems. And we share all that with the manufacturers, which means we serve as the most effective research and development center for the American defense industry. According to a plant manager at Lockheed Martin in Fort Worth, Texas, which manufactures the F-35, F-16, according to him, in a conversation with me, the daily Israeli lessons save the plant anywhere between 10 and 20 years of research and development. To get an idea about the cost of research and development, F-35 also incurred $55 billion research and development. Saving the manufacturer between 10 and 20 years of research and development amounts to mega billion dollars. But more than that, we are enhancing the competitiveness of those American defense products and saving research and development costs. Increasing American exports is also expanding the employment base of the American defense and aerospace industry. We're talking about more than 2.5 Americans employed by the defense industry, which is positively impacted by its so-called showroom, otherwise known as Israel. This type of two-way street, Israel receiving and Israel returning, also takes place in the commercial, non-military market. There is a reason why 250 American high-tech giants decided to establish research and development centers in Israel. They do that in order to leverage the brain power available in Israel. And in many respects, having those research and development centers in Israel has made it possible for the American commercial high-tech industry to maintain its leadership position in the world. Coming back to the military aspects, those lessons which we share with the manufacturers, we also share with the American Air Force. We share it with the American Air Force, namely, we share very, very experienced Air Force lessons with a relatively inexperienced Air Force. Americans, for obvious reasons, don't have the daily national security challenges faced by Israel. Israel has developed game-changing, groundbreaking battle tactics, all of which we share with the Americans. And when the Americans do get into a dogfight, they're going to experience that challenge cushioned in many respects by the Israeli experience. I met many American combat pilots in the US during my visits to the US, and each one of them shared with me the experience of conducting joint exercises with the Israeli Air Force. And their message was very clear. Joining the Israeli Air Force in those exercises has demonstrated to us how really good are the American combat aircraft. And when I asked, how come it's your aircraft? And their response was, the Israelis fly every day under do or die state of mind, which we rarely experience. And when you fly a combat aircraft under do or die state of mind, you have to do it more daringly and more innovatingly, which enhances or upgrades the battle tactics. We share it with the Americans, and by the way, not only when it comes to Air Force, we do it with the special units in the US dealing with urban warfare. We've accumulated much experience urban warfare in Lebanon, in Judea, and Samaria, recently or currently in Gaza, all of which we share with the special operation forces of the United States. Recently, visiting the US Congress, I met with Congressman Zinke from Montana, who happened to be a former commander of the Navy SEALs. And he shared with me his experience and the benefits from that experience through joint exercises with the Israeli Naval Commando. And those are few of many, many such examples. And it's not only day-to-day examples, it also has to do with Israel wars. Israel wars is viewed erroneously as a private matter for Israel. But Israel, in many respects, is fighting Western democracies' war. We are fighting, in many respects, America's own wars. And one example is 1981, when we bombed the Iraqi nuclear reactor in defiance of American pressure to refrain from bombing the Iraqi nuclear reactor. We were punished by the US for devastating the Iraqi nuclear reactor. However, that took place in 1981, and 10 years later, the US was fighting the first Gulf War, January 1991. Then Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney spoke at a defense establishment event in Washington, D.C. following the Gulf War, and his first sentence was, "Thank you, Israel, for destroying the Iraqi nuclear reactor in 1981, which spared us a potential nuclear confrontation in 1991. How many thousands of people's lives were spared by that Israeli action? How many trillions of dollars were spared by that Israeli action? And certainly, how many Arab allies of the US were spared by that action? Because by devastating Iraq's nuclear reactor, we, in many respects, snatched Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Oman, and other allies of the US from the jaws of Saddam Hussein. We're talking about memorable war of 1967 that for some people is a very controversial war. Israel reuniting Jerusalem, Israel returning to Judea and Samaria, the cradle of Jewish history, culture, and language. But people who support the war or who oppose the war tend to ignore one critical issue. On the eve of the June 1967 war, Egypt was on its way, with the help of then Soviet Union, to become the pan-Arab leader, toppling every single pro-American Arab regime. There were 70,000 Egyptian soldiers stationed in Yemen on the eve of the June 67 war, aiming to topple the Saudi regime and introducing a pro-Soviet regime in Saudi Arabia and the other oil-producing Arab allies of the U.S. In 1967, the U.S. was overwhelmingly dependent upon Persian Gulf oil. By Israel devastating, obliterating the Egyptian military infrastructure, we snatched all those Arab allies from the jaws of a potential Soviet-Egyptian takeover of much of the Middle East. In fact, that Israeli victory eventually convinced Egypt that the U.S. would be a better ally for Egypt than the Soviet Union. I'm not saying that in order to get thank you notes for any American watching our conversation, but it seems to me that Americans should realize Israel is involved in a two-way street relation with the U.S. It's not a one-way street, and those relations are mutually beneficial type of relations. I remember visiting Birmingham, Alabama, where I met a former commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps, and he mentioned to me that he spent few years in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, which is the intellectual center of the U.S. Army, where they formulate the battle tactics of the Army. And according to General Chuck Krulek, the former commandant of the U.S. Marine Corps, much of the battle tactics formulation in Fort Leavenworth is conducted based on the Israeli battle experience. I remember meeting active duty colonel, a commander of a special operation battalion on Capitol Hill. Both of us were visiting Capitol Hill, and we accidentally met. And I asked him if he had any experience with Israel while serving as a special operations commander. And he shared with me an experience, 1 year service in Iraq. And he told me that on his way to Iraq, the battalion stopped for 2-week training in Israel with top Israeli experts on facing suicide bombers, car bombs, and the deadly improvised explosive devices. And he concluded his experience by stating that much of the credit to the fact that his battalion came back after a year of service in Iraq without a single fatality was due to those 2 weeks training by Israel's top specialists. And then he added that he spends most of the year traveling around the world, training special operation units of allies of the United States. There's only one country, he told me, where he does not train, but is trained, and that's Israel. And he said, that's your added value to my country. And we're talking about a litany of such examples in the defense sphere and in the commercial sphere. The mere fact that we are where we are in the Middle East benefits the US tremendously, again, away from the limelight. And the reason it benefits the US has to do with our very specific location and capabilities. A former chief of naval operations, Admiral Elmo Zumwalt, and then former Supreme Commander of NATO forces, General Alexander Haig, who eventually became US Secretary of State, both of them referred to Israel as the largest American aircraft carrier, which does not require a single American on board, cannot be sunk. And if there would not be Israel, then you would have, or the US would have, to manufacture few more real aircraft carriers, deploy it to the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean, and accompany it by 5 or 6 ground divisions. All that attention by the US, according to General Haig and Admiral Zumwalt, has to do with the location of Israel between Europe and Asia and Africa, between the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, Indian Ocean, and the Persian Gulf. This is an area with 48% of proven proven oil reserves. This is an area which is the chief epicenter of anti-US global Islamic terrorism. This is an area with very critical intersections of trade sea lanes between Asia and Western Europe. And when it comes to substituting Israel with real aircraft carriers, if there would not be Israel around, people have to bear in mind, while Israel is a beneficiary of an annual American investment of $3.8 billion to manufacture one, what I would call super aircraft carrier, cost anywhere between $10 and $13 billion. One such aircraft carrier. If you don't want a super aircraft carrier, the smaller ones are anywhere from $2.5 billion to $9 billion each to deploy another single ground division to the Middle East to replace what Israel is doing right now for the US would require some $2.5 billion to deploy, to maintain, and to operate. And certainly, when you talk about the intelligence received by the US from Israel, once again, we're talking about the very special experience and capabilities by Israel. Unlike the vast majority of Americans, in Israel we have large number of people whose origin happens to be in Arab countries in the Middle East. Namely, Israel is much more integrated into the Middle East culture and Middle East ethnicity and Middle East religion when it comes to conducting intelligence operations against anti-American Islamic terrorists. The Israeli qualities, the Israeli profile has been very, very helpful, preempting anti-American Islamic terrorist acts in the Persian Gulf, in Jordan, in Syria, in Iraq, and throughout the world, including on the American homeland soil. We're talking about the value of that intelligence which we share, not only with regard to countering and preempting terrorism, but also with regard to Soviet, in the past, currently Russian military system, Chinese military system, and European military system, which we face every single day on the battlefield. We have shared our experience facing those military systems, with the Americans benefiting again, the American defense industry and the American armed forces. And a former chief of U.S. Air Force intelligence, General George Keegan, was asked once, how do you evaluate the scope of the intelligence received by the U.S. from Israel? And he mentioned in an interview to the New York Times that if the U.S. were to procure all that intelligence on its own, then the U.S. would have to establish 5 CIAs. Now, mind you, the annual budget for one CIA is around $15 billion. I remember talking with the former chairman of Senate Intelligence Committee about U.S. Israel relations in the area of intelligence sharing, and his comment was that every member of the Intelligence Committee knows the amount of intelligence and the valuable intelligence received by the U.S. from Israel is much larger and much more meaningful than the scope of intelligence received from all NATO countries combined. So when you add our mere existence in the area, which spares the U.S. to manufacture more aircraft carriers and deploy them to the Middle East and deploy ground forces to the Middle East, sharing our intelligence, constituting the showroom of the defense and the aerospace industry, enhancing the U.S. competitiveness in the global market, providing the commercial high-tech industry in the U.S. with a very substantial edge over competitors in the world. All that, in my mind, substantiate the notion that Israel is not a burden on the U.S. Israel is a unique ally of the U.S., and unique ally is also a relative term. Relative to every single European country, we are indeed a unique ally. European allies of the U.S. and their attitude towards the U.S. at a time of emergency depends on the nature of the government in the particular NATO country or non-NATO country. It depends on the public mood in that country. Is it left of center or right of center? In Israel, whether it is left of center or right of center government, whether we are talking about the religious public or the secular public, the conservative or the liberal, there is a huge majority of Israelis who feel as unconditional allies of the U.S., unlike, again, most European countries. And those European countries which are also unconditional, they do not have the battle experience that we have. They do not serve as we do as the battle-tested laboratory for the American defense industry and the American armed forces. And therefore, on a rainy day, the U.S. knows very well that they can trust Israel. I can compare it to a football game, a few seconds left to the end of the game, and the ball is on the 30-yard line of a team which is 5 points behind, and the quarterback knows that this is the most critical game. You can lose or win. And the quarterback, which in this case is the U.S., knows very well it can trust the Israeli wide receiver to receive that pass and score a winning touchdown. I don't think there's any other ally, be it European ally, South Korean or Japanese ally, that can perform that service for the United States. The June Air Force offensive on Iran, the first 10, 11 days by Israel, and then came the American offensive, sheds light on the very viable cooperation between U.S. and Israel and the value to the U.S. In the mind of too many people, Israel is fighting merely its own war against Iran, and Iran is a threat to Israel, to Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Bahrain, but not to the US. The fact has been that fighting the Ayatollah regime of Iran, Israel is fighting a regime which since its February 1979 toppling of the Shah of Iran and taking over control of Iran has been driven by a 1400-year-old vision which mandates the regime to topple every single Sunni Islamic regime, which means every single Arab ally of the US, and then proceed to the number one goal of the Ayatollahs according to its vision, and this is to bring the Western infidel to submission, and especially what they call the great American Satan. That vision is not only a rhetorical vision. That vision is deeply embedded in the Iranian school system. It's being underscored every single Friday in the mosque sermons. It is very much emphasized in the official Iranian media, and certainly it's being carried out every single day by the regime, carried out namely well beyond the Persian Gulf and beyond the Middle East, where the Ayatollah regime, in collaboration with Hezbollah, Shiite terrorists, have entrenched themselves very deep inside South America and Central America, in fact, all the way to the US-Mexico border and into the US. And that entrenchment means, for instance, that the Ayatollah regime and Hezbollah have conducted since 1980, they have conducted terrorist training camps in South America, mostly in the tri-border area of Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, and the smaller tri-border area of Chile and Bolivia and Peru. Some of the graduates of those terrorist training camps are deployed to the Middle East, but many are deployed northward towards the United States. The Ayatollah regime since 1980 has collaborated with every single drug cartel in Latin America, mostly Mexican drug cartel. They've provided the Mexican drug cartels with equipment to construct underground tunnels between Mexico and the US in order to transfer terrorists and drug traffickers into the US. They've supplied Venezuela, which is their arch ally in Latin America. They've provided them, as well as the drug cartels, with Iranian-developed and Iranian-made Predator unmanned aerial vehicles aimed to be operated against the US. All those assessments are not my own assessments. Anyone who studies the 4 hearings conducted by former FBI Director Chris Wray in the aftermath of the October 7, 2023 war, he conducted 2 hearings in the House the Homeland Security Committee and the Appropriations Subcommittee on Homeland Security, and then the same two committees in the Senate. And in every single hearing, he underlined the warning that October 7 is already inspiring Iranian-controlled Islamic terrorists to repeat the same act of terrorism on U.S. soil. In fact, in the 2025 threat assessment published by the FBI, by the Homeland Security Department, and by the Director of National Intelligence, that threat assessment for 2025 stipulates that the Ayatollah regime of Iran, together with China and Russia, are already acting on U.S. soil, planning terrorist acts against the U.S. government and U.S. citizens. And therefore, when Israel fights Iran, we are also fighting America's own war. One of the reasons the Ayatollah of Iran and other Islamic terrorists are fighting Israel is because they understand, they know that Israel is the most important vanguard of the US, of the Western world in the Middle East. And they know also that Israel, in many respects, is the role model of countering terrorism, which is inspiring the Western world. And therefore, they have decided, and very smartly so, to try and undermine the US ally Israel as a prelude to bring the Western infidel to submission. The weaker is Israel, they assume, then the weaker is the Western world. I would add that the stronger is Israel, the less military presence the US needs in the Middle East. It has been for a long time US aim to minimize its military presence in the Middle East. But at the same time, the US cannot ignore the fact that the Middle East constitutes a very critical area for the economy and the national security and homeland security of the United States. Suffice to say that the major engine of anti-American terrorism is anti-American Islamic terrorism is right here in the Middle East. Having Israel allows the US to minimize its presence in the Middle East. The more effective is Israel, the less need is there for the US to increase its deployment into the Middle East. I would say that if there would be an Israel-like ally in the Persian Gulf, there wouldn't be a need for American military bases in the Persian Gulf. Unlike other allies of the US, we in Israel do not want and do not have American military bases. The Israeli military is fully manned by Israel. We don't want any non-Israelis fighting for Israel. I would add that when it comes to Europe, we're talking about some $37 billion invested by the US year in and year out, in addition to some 80,000 soldiers. You don't need to do it in Israel. And all that for a $3.8 billion annual investment in Israel. Likewise, the military bases in South Korea, the military bases in Japan, and the American soldiers there. Israel is a unique, what I call proactive ally. And sometimes we have to do our fighting in defiance on the US. It takes some time for the US then to realize that the military operation carried out by Israel which the US frowns upon, in fact, is advancing American interests. When it comes to President Trump, there's one critical element which unfortunately doesn't get the due attention in media coverage of President Trump and U.S. Israel relations. One of the last acts of his first presidency, namely January 2021, before vacating the White House, the president made a decision to transfer Israel to the area of CENTCOM, the U.S. Central Command. Until then, we were part of the European Command, which is not too relevant to Israel. Shifting Israel to CENTCOM has upgraded, I would say, in a revolutionary manner, the cooperation between the two defense systems, the American and the Israeli. Shifting Israel to CENTCOM has made the relations between the US military forces and Israel much, much more intimate and therefore much more productive for the sake of both the US and Israel. And we have seen the byproduct or the fruit of that decision in the most recent war against Iran and in the ongoing war between Israel, Hamas, and Hezbollah. We have never had so many visits by American military officers as we have had during the last 2 years. And the reason has not been for America to come to Israel and advise Israel how to fight the war. The reason has been for Americans to leverage Israel as a site of battle-tested laboratory to see how do we face the underground terror operation in Gaza. How do we fight the underground terror operation in Lebanon? Because Americans know one day they may have to face such a reality, either in the Middle East or between the US and Mexico border or some other areas. But in dollar terms, in military terms, the decision by President Trump to transfer Israel to CENTCOM has produced a major return on investment for both the US and Israel. Moreover, to President Trump's credit, he is, as far as I know, the only American president who had the guts and the sense to remove the establishment of the State Department from center stage of setting foreign and national security policy, both during his first term and the current second term. Appointing Marco Rubio to be the Secretary of State in a way was a slap in the face of the State Department establishment, because anyone who followed Marco Rubio's career in the House and then in the Senate knows that Marco Rubio was not enamored with the State Department establishment. And to the credit of President Trump, removing the State Department from the center stage has produced the Abraham Accords, because the Abraham Accords defy the State Department establishment. State Department establishment has always believed that the Palestinian issue is the major core problem in the Middle East. The Palestinian issue supposedly is a crown jewel for Arab policymakers, and if you want to advance Arab-Israeli peace, it must go through the Palestinian issue. The fact is that the Abraham Accords were conceived by bypassing the Palestinian issue. I might add that the peace agreements between Israel and Egypt, Israel and Jordan were also achieved by bypassing the Palestinian issue. Last and not least, it seems to me that President Trump definitely comprehends the value rendered by Israel to the United States, and therefore his decision to allow transfer literally of any military system needed and required by Israel, unlike his predecessors, which stopped for too long the supply of some very, very critical military systems and ammunition to Israel. My only hope is that President Trump also will eventually realize that when it comes to the Middle East, we're not talking about signing an accord and ending war, but we're dealing with a region where there hasn't been yet intra-Muslim, intra-Arab peaceful coexistence for the last 1400 years. And therefore, sitting down with the Ayatollah regime and concluding an agreement may create the impression that the conflict is over, but based on track record of the Ayatollahs and of the Middle East at large, this is going to be a tenuous state of affairs, not a permanent state of affairs, and likewise with Syria. Well, anyone who would like to refer to me to express opposing views, criticism, or seek some information, my email address is yoramtex, YORAMTEX @gmail.com, and my website has plenty of information. It's theettingerreport.com, Ettinger with double T.
Thank you again for joining me on this edition of Proclaiming Justice. Please share this podcast with your family and friends. For more information about how you can get involved, please visit our website at pjtn.org. As a PJTN Watchman, you can help us keep up the fight to preserve our freedom for our children and their children for such a time as this.